Thanks for the introduction. Hi everyone, so I'm Guy Hanson from ReturnPath. I lead ReturnPath's international consulting team, so I've got a team of people, some of whom are based here in London and right in this room, also located in France, Germany, Brazil and Australia, so we're all over the place. Outside of ReturnPath, I also play a role with the Direct Marketing Association. I sit on the email council there and in fact chair that body at the moment, and we'll refer to that once or twice as we go through the presentation. So just a quick word about ReturnPath. So we are well known in the world of email for providing deliverability solutions, and probably nobody to touch us globally in terms of providing solutions, data and services that help you as email senders get your emails into your customers' inboxes. But we're not just about deliverability. We work with email programs to help them optimize their performance across the full subscriber lifecycle. We apply managed services to our customers as well to help them achieve those levels of improvement and optimization. And as you just heard, we've recently formalized a partnership arrangement with FreshMail. So for all of you who are FreshMail customers or intending on becoming FreshMail customers, you've now got access to the full range of ReturnPath products and services and solutions to help you achieve that with your programs too. So we're going to talk about email deliverability, and it's not a particularly sexy subject, but it's an important one because all of the great stuff that you've heard about so far today in terms of testing your program in a number of great different ways and optimizing for your conversions, it all counts for nothing if you aren't getting your emails delivered to your customers in the first place, because if they don't see your emails, they're not going to engage with them, they're not going to respond to them, and they're not going to buy your products and services. And this is a real challenge. So here's our most recent deliverability benchmark report, which was issued a couple of months ago. There's a new one coming out imminently. And just to be clear, when we talk about deliverability, we're not really talking about the traditional bounce metric that a lot of people report on deliverability, which is effectively we've sent 1,000 emails and 10 of those bounce back, and therefore our deliverability rate is 99%. What we're factoring in here is, firstly, you don't necessarily get a bounce notification. You usually do, but it's not a given. And the other thing is that even if your emails do get delivered, where are they delivered to? Because they may not be in the inbox where you want them to be in front of mind with your customers. They may end up getting delivered technically to the address, but into the spam folder or junk folder. So we talk about a metric called inbox placement rate. And globally, you will see that across 2016, average inbox placement rate around the world for all marketing senders is 79%. So that's got big implications for email senders, because it basically means that 1 out of every 5 emails that they are sending to permissioned audiences and all of the investment that they've made in setting up those campaigns and coming up with great offers, great creative, they're not getting seen. In the UK, fortunately, it's a slightly better story. Average inbox placement rate here running at around 88%. But again, if you flip that over, the bad news story is still that on average, 1 out of every 8 emails being sent is not getting delivered to the inbox where you want it to be. So we're going to talk about some deliverability basics and also some new factors which are impacting on email deliverability. And most of you will be aware that we had an election last week, so I did quite a lot of research based on the email campaigns which the various political parties were sending. And I've layered a few of those examples into this presentation just to provide some illustrations and bring some of the things I'm talking about to life a bit. So when we talk about sender reputation, here's a definition for you. It's an indication of the trustworthiness of an email sender's program. And there's a couple of different tools and services that you can use to ascertain what your sender reputation looks like. ReturnPath offers a service called SenderScore, which you will find at senderscore.org, and it typically generates a score of between 0 to 100, which is an indication of how major mailbox providers like the Hotmails and the Yahoos and the Gmails of the world see your email program. And you want that score to be as close to 100 as possible. The further away from 100 you move, the less of a good actor you are seen as being in the context of being an email sender. And I think, just in terms of debunking a couple of myths, I've lost count of the number of people that I've come across who assume that a good sender score, if you're getting a sender score of 95 or 96, it's some kind of guarantee that you're going to get great deliverability. It's not. You probably are, but it's not because you've got a sender score of 96. 96 is the reflection of how you are seen because you are a good sender generating great deliverability. So what influences your sender reputation? A number of factors, and we'll run through them fairly quickly. But one of the most important ones is spam complaints, and this is basically when you are sending out your emails and for a variety of reasons, which we'll look at a little bit more closely in a moment, your customers don't want to receive those emails anymore. They can't be bothered to unsubscribe, or they can't find your unsubscribe link, or it doesn't work. And so they go and hit the spam button instead. And that's really a behavior that you want to discourage, because it's a metric which every major mailbox provider monitors. And if they see those rates creeping up for you as a sender, it's basically raising a red flag and saying, not so hot. A lot of their customers are complaining about the emails you're sending to them. You can't be that great a sender. The second factor, just jumping around a little bit, mailing to unknown users. So this is a function of your data quality. And you want to be sending out a high quality list. You don't want to be sending out a load of junk email addresses which are generating high levels of bounce backs, because those email addresses don't exist anymore, they no longer function. That's another very clear indicator of a poor sender who can't be bothered to take care of the hygiene of their list. And really, it's a two-way transaction, and the mailbox providers are going to be saying, well, if you can't take the time and trouble to make sure that you're maintaining and sending to a clean list, well, maybe we can't take the time and trouble to help you deliver your emails. Another very, very important point is this issue of spam traps. So these are emails which should never have been in your list in the first place. Two types of spam traps. We refer to pristine traps. These are often also called harvested addresses. So typical example might be an email address which was deliberately seeded on a web page somewhere with the intention that an automated program which goes around the web looking for email addresses finds it, sticks it into a list, and if it ever gets sent to by a reputable program, the immediate assumption there is no way that that address should have found its way into a correctly permissioned program, and you are going to be punished in the form of blocking and poor deliverability as a result. There's also the principle of recycled traps, less aggressive than pristine traps, but basically old addresses, which the likes of your Microsofts and Gmails will co-opt some of those and basically monitor for them for their own purposes moving forwards. You definitely want to be monitoring for blacklists and making sure that your email program isn't listed with any of the major blacklists. That will have an impact on your sender reputation. Conversely, you want to make sure that where appropriate, your email program is registered and signed up with one or more of the major whitelisting programs. And a quick punt for ReturnPath certification there while we're talking about it. And then finally, subscriber engagement. How your customers are interacting with your emails, and are those interactions positive or negative? The mailbox providers have a slightly different view from what you might typically have of what engagement means. We'll cover that in a few minutes' time. So this is what it looks like, an illustration for you. So here we've plotted average complaint rates against sender reputation scores, where the scores increase in increments of 10. So 0 to 10, 11 to 20, moving across to 100. So you can see that the programs which are generating the lowest average complaint rates are also associated with the highest average reputation scores. And this is what it means. So here we're looking at inbox placement rates, delivery rates, and exactly what you might expect to see, that the programs with the highest reputation scores, 91 or higher, are also those that are getting the best inbox placement / deliverability rates. So here's an example for you. It's the first of the election examples which we're talking about. So what we're looking at here is the average sender score for the Conservative Party's email program in the 4-week run-up to the elections. And mostly it was doing okay. They were running fairly stable. And you can see here they had an interesting dip in performance. And that was specifically because of this email. And basically, it's Theresa May saying, I need you to do this one thing for me. Now, there's two things going on here. The first was that this particular email got sent to pretty much the whole of the Conservatives' mailing list. So you've got their engaged subscribers, but you've also got a load of less engaged subscribers who are probably more predisposed to go and hit the complaint button when they receive these emails. The other thing is that the overall tone of this particular email, quite alarmist, a little bit negative, and I'll show you some analysis in a few slides' time where we can see that on average the general response of political party subscribers to more negative, alarmist tone of emails is really to reach for the junk button. So that basically combined these two factors, and you can see that there was a significant dip in the performance of the Conservatives program at the point that they sent this email. Aligned with that, I can tell you for a fact that roughly a third of the total emails from that particular send ended up in their customers' spam folders as a result. So that's like a real-life illustration of sender reputation metrics in action. So let's look in slightly more detail at some of those principal drivers. We talked about complaints. Here's an even more extreme example for you. We saw exactly one email campaign from UKIP, and there's probably a reason for that. So they sent out this email from Paul Oakton relatively early in the campaign, and again, pretty negative. Theresa May and her Conservative Party will let us down on Brexit, and you've got to sort of vote for us to make sure that we continue to hold them to account. Now here I don't think it's that much about the messaging. I'm not going to get involved in a debate about our respective political affiliations, but I think two things happened. This was probably an early indication of where UKIP's vote was going to go, as shown by email intelligence. I think they probably had a lot of people on their mailing list from the previous election where it was quite fashionable to exercise a protest vote against the Conservatives by going for UKIP instead. And I think this time around, a lot of those same members had probably decided that they were going to go back or vote for one of the more mainstream parties. So when they received this email, the first thing that crosses their mind is, that's wasted, I'm not going with them anymore. Plus the fact that, again, it's a pretty negative, unambitious tone of message. And this is actually pretty exceptional. 1 out of every 4 recipients went and hit the spam button for this particular campaign. Now, normally we talk about complaint rates where sort of 1% is pretty bad, 25% is quite exceptional, and well over half of those total emails ended up in the spam folder. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we didn't see another major campaign from them over the course of the election campaign. Now, we also talked about the importance of unknown users, and we have this principle of what we call primary addresses. So a primary address is the email address which all of you want your customers to be giving to you. It's the address which they log into every day. It's the address that they probably use for a lot of their personal correspondence, as well as their sort of preferred brands. And it's the one which they generate most of their read activity from. So for any of you as an email sender, you want your customers to be giving you their primary addresses. So this is a graph showing the percentage of primary addresses which each of the political parties managed to achieve. We can see that the Liberal Democrats and the Scottish National Party were doing best there. And this is important because the likelihood of getting a primary address from your customers, there's a strong function of trust going on there. If they trust you as a brand and a sender to do the right thing with their email address and their personal data, and not to abuse that by ending up sending you a lot of stuff that they never expected, they are more likely to give you that primary address. Now, this was the breakdown across the political parties again. And what I've highlighted, flipping this conversation over, is the number of dead addresses on their respective lists. Now, remember that these aren't dead just for the purposes of the individual senders. They're not just dead to the Conservatives. These are addresses which the actual subscriber, the actual address owner, is no longer logging into or interacting for any email program. And so as a driver of sender reputation and deliverability, you want to be getting those off your list. Basically, what we're saying here is that 1 in every 20 addresses on the Conservatives list is useless. It's not going to respond if you mail to it 1,000 times. And that was probably one of the reasons for that dip in performance that we saw on the previous graph. Also note in the read profile columns, and you will see basically that between 97 to 100% of all of the reads are coming from those primary addresses. So even the secondary addresses, which is typically that sort of Yahoo address or that Gmail address, which is used for competition entries or surveys, they're not necessarily dead, but they're also extremely non-responsive. And as a sender, even as a marketing sender, those are the ones that you'd be looking to target and say, right, let's wind down the activity, let's repermission them, and if they don't respond to that, let's get rid of them, because they are not helping with your program's deliverability. Final point I wanted to talk about was authentication, a highly technical topic, but there's a variety of different approaches which you as a sender can take to prove that you are a good sender, that the IP addresses that the email addresses come from are authorized to send the domain which is being used, that the email hasn't been tampered with, and in the case of DMARC, basically providing you with the ability to feed back to major mailbox providers and say, if we do see any suspect activity which doesn't meet those criteria, it's not ours, and you can block it. So we ranked all of the parties to see how they performed in terms of authentication. They were all doing a pretty good job. They all had the sender policy framework in place. They all had domain keys identified mail in place. 2 of them had DMARC in place, which basically saying, did that really help with their deliverability? Did that add the sort of extra missing factor? Possibly not, but it was a good indicator of an email program that probably knew what it was doing and thinking about that extra step that it ought to be taking. We also saw a lot of phishing and spoofing activity going on against the various programs. Far less so against these guys because of that DMARC sign-up which they were applying. And that has an important role in terms of subscriber trust with the program, because the moment you as a legitimate signee are starting to receive emails claiming to come from the brand that you've signed up, but actually not, and they're attempting to sell you knockoff Rolexes or cheap Viagra, that actually diminishes your trust in the legitimate program too, and you'll start to see performance tank as a result. So let's just pull it all together briefly. Now, this was fairly subjective, but what I did was I took 6 of these key criteria and I scored each of the programs in terms of, did I feel that they had done an above average job, an average job, or a below average job, or it wasn't even in place for each of these important deliverability criteria. And we ended up with a weighted score in the second last column. Now, what you will notice, and I've color-coded it just to make it easy to see, is that the programs with the highest average weighted score, i.e. the ones which, admittedly, slightly subjectively, were doing the best in terms of against a standard set of deliverability best practices, were indeed generating the best inbox placement rates, and vice versa. So a really nice example in action of how these factors can impact on successful deliverability or otherwise for your programs. And this would have had a huge impact for the political parties, for the ones getting 80% or below. A lot of these emails, there was a strong call to action. Volunteer your time for us. Make a donation to help our campaign funds. Get out and vote on election day. And if 1 in every 5 of those messages isn't being seen, it's obviously going to have a major impact on the success of those campaigns. Now, we also talked about how subscriber engagement has an important impact on your program's deliverability. And again, sort of continuing with this election-related theme, these were the average read rates which the various political parties generated. The Scottish National Party had a pretty small programme, a small base, but what they were doing well and getting average read rates of 46%. I left UKIP out of this particular one because it was only the one campaign which they got slightly less than 10% for. But as I said, the mailbox providers, so the Gmails, the Hotmails, etc. of the world, have a slightly different view of what engagement looks like, because they base it on the behaviours which they can see your customers exhibiting in their inboxes. So some of these will be familiar. Opens are important to them. Filing, so saving the email to another folder, adding to an address book. Those are all positive actions. Complaints, which we've already touched, negative. Deleted without reading, so you've successfully delivered the email, but the only action rather than having it opened and read is to delete it. That's a negative activity, as is moving emails directly to the junk folder. And then you'll see a couple where I've actually given 2 thumbs up, and this was basically the feedback which we've had directly from the mailbox providers. You'll see I've listed our source going back to the email evolution conference from a couple of years ago, where they were all up on stage and asked, what is important to you guys? Gmail in particular said that replying and forwarding sends out a very strong indicator of a good sender, because you've received something where either the offer or the content, or perhaps you even just told a good joke, but you've done something in that email to persuade the recipient that it's actually worth sharing with a friend or a colleague or a family member, and that sends out a highly positive signal that it must be a good email. And similarly, recovering emails that have been accidentally delivered to the junk folder. If you really wanted it and you've gone to the time and trouble of running through your junk folder and saying, that shouldn't be there, I want it back in my inbox, that's a great positive signal to the mailbox providers, because you're actually saying to them, hey, you know, you guys made a mistake with that one. It's a good email and your subscriber really wanted it and they've gone to the time and trouble of actually going to look for it and pulling it back into their inbox. So here's a few illustrations for you. So if you signed up for the Green Party, and this was held true for several of the other parties too, they asked for your postcode so they could do localized campaigns as well. And so in this particular case, in addition to the nationwide campaigns, we're getting some specific ones for West Central London. And I categorized all of the campaigns that we saw by the level of targeting they did. And really, for all of you as email professionals, and especially for those of you who are doing a great job testing, you will see that the response rates to the highly targeted campaigns were significantly greater than for either the partially targeted or the non-targeted. But coming back to these behavioral metrics, this is where it starts to get quite interesting, because in addition to just the read rates, you can see that the blue line showing user marked spam, that's the level of complaints, far lower than for the non-targeted sends. And the black line showing mailbox provider marked spam, the amount of filtering that's going on that's ending up in the junk folder or the spam folder, was actually the lowest across all 3 categories. So perhaps telling us what we already know, but interesting to see it in action across the political campaigns. Similarly for personalization, and this email from Labour, you can see they personalized the subject line. They also personalized the first line of the paragraph. Thank you for being one of our amazing volunteers, Guy. And then Guy's plan, literally giving me a little map and telling me what route I need to take to my local polling station, which was quite a nice touch. So how effective was personalization? Well, we can see that average read rates for all of the campaigns that were personalized were marginally higher by about 1.5%. But what you can also see is that complaint rates were significantly lower for the personalized campaigns. And I think, part of that is that, not only is personalization good because you respond to it, but I think when you're looking at a negative metric like a complaint rate, it can also operate in your favor. Our name is a very personal attribute to us. you're less likely to exhibit a negative behavior against an email where your name features, because it's almost like you're complaining against your name. And perhaps there's some psychology going on there, which makes it less likely. A few other things that we looked at, and this sort of talks very closely to the presentation that we just had from Kath, and sort of thinking about how some of those softer behaviors play out as a result of tweaks with language, certain words and approaches that you take. And very briefly, 4 that we looked at. A very strong trend during the election was who the emails were claiming to come from, and a lot of them would select the party leader. So these emails would land in your inbox, and the friendly from would be saying Theresa May or Jeremy Corbyn or Tim Farron. But not in all cases. Sometimes it just came from the party, so Green Party, Labour Party, etc. And in some cases they used other party personalities. And we can see that there were some distinct variations in response rate. We can see that where they claimed to come from the leader, your read rates on average were slightly higher. But watch what happens to that complaint rate. It goes up significantly as you move away from the emails claiming to come from a person compared with the ones which were just on behalf of the party. And we can also see here in purple, we're looking at that deleted without reading metric, significantly higher as we stopped referring to a specific person and generically referred to the party instead. Similar test to sense of urgency. So here, basically what we're talking about is the kind of emails that's saying, I need you to get out and vote for me. They're really sort of telling you what to do. And as marketers, we might think that's a good and effective approach, but less so in the political landscape. And actually we can see that the campaigns with a lower sense of urgency actually performed better. And perhaps this is the electorate being a little bit contrary and saying, I'm not interested in you telling me what to do. I'll make up my own mind, I'll read through your policies and I'll decide don't tell me what to do. And we can see that in addition to getting lower read rates for those high sense of urgencies, negative metrics like complaints and filtering were also higher for those high sense of urgency campaigns. I also talked about tone of voice, and I categorized all of the campaigns that we looked at by whether I deemed them to be positive in tone, negative in tone, everything else I deemed to be neutral. So positive might be, sort of a bright new future for Britain. Negative would be, if we lose 6 seats, we're going to lose our majority. Don't let those bastards get in. No, that's not quite what they said, but... And interestingly, what you can see is that across the read rates, the red bar, no significant variance by tone of voice. But again, looking at those other metrics, the complaints, the filtering, significantly higher where that negative approach had been taken. And you can see a distinct sense from these email recipients saying, don't really like that negative stuff. Stop bashing up your opponent's policies, start focusing on your own and telling us why they might be good for us. And then the last example for you, positioning. So when I'm talking about positioning, it's basically where is the focus of the message? Is it me saying, I want you to do something, or putting you at the center of the message, saying, we'd love you to get out and support us on Thursday. And then we also had an intermediate one, which was kind of us or togetherness, we're all in this together. And this was a slightly surprising finding for me, because where I've done these tests before, generally the greatest success is where it's putting you, the recipient, in the driving seat. It's all about you. But I think from a political point of view, this was a very almost presidential style election where the party leaders were really put first and foremost, and it was almost that you were voting for the personalities as much as you were voting for the party that they represented. And what you can see on that last graph is that the average read rates, where the message was all about, I want you to support us, I want you to vote for us on election day, were highest, and also the lowest complaint rates. So just some illustrations for you about how fairly soft behavioral tactics can have a significant impact, not just on the response rates to your campaigns, but also in the way that they influence some of these hidden metrics which are so important to the Gmails and the Hotmails, etc. of the world in terms of how they see you as a good sender or a bad sender. One last thing that we saw, subject line emojis, always a hot topic, and the Liberal Democrats really went to town, and a lot of their emails had loads and loads of different symbols in them. Here's some examples. Most of them fairly self-explanatory. I was a bit puzzled by this one the first time I saw it. I thought it was a porcupine, but actually it's like a rainbow coming out from behind a cloud. And, you know, so they were the ones that were talking about a brighter future for you and your family and putting a little rainbow in the subject line. And I think what we saw is that it was a little bit hit and miss in terms of the response rates that they generated. Most of them were above benchmark for the campaign. But I think one thing we have learned is it's all about relevance. You know, what do they add to the message in terms of reinforcing the story that it's trying to tell? And so the second last one, where they were promoting the BBC debate that night and putting a couple of TV screens on it, that was actually one of the Lib Dems' best performing emails of the whole campaign. And I think it was just because it made sense. You know, there is a debate on TV, reinforced by a couple of TVs, and that worked extremely well for them. If you want to learn more about it, a quick little push here. We've actually just released a great report on the subject of emojis and email subject lines, so grab yourself a copy and find out which ones work best and which don't. I'm not going to sort of succumb to spoiler alert, but you might find that the sort of most effective one comes as a surprise. Dan, my colleague in the front row, is smiling at me. So pulling it all together, so this is about engagement data and also about what we learned from the analysis of the elections. You know, so I think it's bearing in mind that, as I say, the mailbox providers have this slightly unusual idea of what they deem to be engagement. And, you know, you as senders might be sitting there thinking, well, that's a bit difficult. You know, we can't really measure, you know, what percentage of our emails get brought out of the junk folder or what percentage get forwarded. You can. There are tools and services which help you see that, but you can also be intentional about designing your emails for that. You know, in the elections, you know, one of the most effective emails in terms of generating organic forwards was when Labour released their manifesto, and it literally just said, please share with your friends and family. And a lot of people did. And so they generated these organic forwards which make them look like a really good sender. I also wrote up a series of blogs where we used a lot of the data which we've just run through. And as has become sort of a little bit of a tradition, I made a prediction. This blog got published last week, Wednesday, and I've just underlined what my prediction was using our email data and the way that the recipients of the various political parties were responding to their email campaigns. And that was the final graph on the BBC website. So just a very small humble brag, but actually I nailed it. And that's what you too can do with email intelligence data. And if you want to read those blogs, whoops, I jumped straight past it. Jump onto our website and have a look. It was a series of 3, and hopefully you'll find it interesting reading. So this is kind of what's going on in the world of deliverability at the moment. I think if I had to sum it up for you, you know, the basics still apply. You know, the factors that influence how you get seen as a good sender in terms of things like keeping a low complaint rate, keeping a low bounce rate, not letting any spam traps on your list, making sure you stay off blacklist, making sure you are on whitelist, all still apply. And we saw a very visual example from that from the analysis that I showed you midway through the presentation. Increasingly, engagement and the way that your customers are interacting with your emails in their inboxes is becoming increasingly important too. Some of it's easy to do because it's the engagement that you as email senders have always aspired to achieve with your customers anyway. And you know what? If you're getting good open rates and good click rates and good conversion rates, you're probably getting a fairly decent job in terms of generating the engagement that you want to see anyway. But bear in mind that there are these hidden metrics, deleted unread, forward, recovered from spam, which also have an extremely important role. Even if you don't have visibility of them, you can as senders be thinking about how you design your emails to try and influence and promote those behaviors. And get creative about how you analyze your campaign data too. You know, it's not just in terms of analyzing for, you know, creative effectiveness or offer effectiveness. I think, as you heard from Kath earlier, and as you've seen from some of the examples I've just shown you, you know, fairly subtle approaches, things like tone of voice, tone of message, positioning of who's talking to who, all have an impact in terms of response rate and also those engagement metrics that are so important to the mailbox providers. So there we go. Hope it was interesting. Hope you've learned something. As we heard, the presentations will be shared, so do make sure you get a copy and go through it at your leisure. You've got my contact details on it. Any sort of questions after the fact, drop me an email. Happy to respond to them. Got a couple of colleagues in the auditorium as well that you can chat to, as well as myself, and hope it was useful.